Hello everybody, thank you for joining me. This is the part 2 video for this service on this Timex 400. This is the reassembly, and in the first video we covered on how this movement is more typical of a Swiss-like movement than what is often found in vintage Timexes, which are much more, much less expensively made, more industrial, and certainly not anywhere near as service friendly as the Timex 400. All right, let's get this started. A little oil on the spring and a little oil on the arbor. We'll cap the barrel here. Make sure this is pressed on evenly and completely all the way around. A little oil here for the center wheel. Get the center wheel on. Some lubrication for the barrel wheel. Get the barrel wheel on. Touch of lubrication here on this side of the center wheel. We'll go ahead and put this little center wheel cock on. Now if you'll remember in the first video, the disassembly, that cock was on there very tight. It promised to be maybe difficult to get back on because you have to be careful. It's so tight. Just pressing pretty firmly here with my finger. It just does not feel good going on there. I'll put a little oil on that side. We'll screw in and then get our escape wheel in. It's a little early, but I'm going to go ahead and get that in there and see if I can get that in the pivot hole. Might be a little easier now than later. Gently. And we'll get the barrel bridge on. This is when you don't have to worry as much about breaking anything. Touch of lubrication on top of the barrel arbor. And we'll get this screws set and screwed down. Man, sometimes these screws drop right in, and sometimes you just wonder if it's magnetized, which can happen. But sometimes it's just all about your tweezer work. I generally like to do a counter rotation for just a little bit to make sure that the threads are seated correctly before I start tightening the screws. So if you see me go backwards a little bit, that's why I'm doing that. Back and then forward. Get our next wheel on through this little hole here in the cock. Very gently. Make sure that's seated. And now get our second wheel on, and we'll get this bridge for the training wheels on. Now this can be fiddly. You got to get these pivots lined up in the holes, and this is sped up because, well, I struggled, and I spared you the torment. But you'll notice the bridge is off. And I narrowed it down to this cock. Remember how I mentioned this cock was very tight? Well, it might have felt tight, but it actually was not in place. So I got that pushed down firmly and screwed down, and I resume getting the wheels back in place again. Get our escape wheel into the pivot there. And our seconds wheel again. And now we'll try this bridge again and see if we can get our pivots lined up appropriately. Want to be very gentle here because you don't want to break anything. Just a little test. It's not quite there. A little tap. See if I can get it to drop, and that looks pretty good. I'm a little nervous that it's going to pop out of place as I get these screws in. A lot of people will keep the pressure down with a little stick. And I got a little piece of pegwood here, hoping to keep that bridge from shifting around as I tighten the screws. And we'll do a little test here to see how everything looks. Gently give a little spin, and that's what we want to see. And we'll go ahead and oil these jewels while we have this side. Next up, I'm going to grab one of my tiniest screwdrivers. And we'll remove this jewel here. It's all connected to this plate. Tiny little screw. It's like the size of dirt. And we just about lost that. There's the one we need. No, I do clean this off camera with some alcohol, dry it, and now I'm putting a drop of oil and putting it right back in place. Now, see that little ring? I didn't mention this in the first video, but that's for the ratchet wheel, and it's very easy to lose. Sometimes it'll stick to the inside of the wheel like that. Sometimes it'll remain stuck on the movement, but just be very careful. Here I'm putting a little oil on the movement where that ring goes, which I dropped the ring into the movement, but I'm luckily able to extract it with minimal fuss. So the oil on that post will help hold that ring on there. Then we'll put a little oil on the outside and get the ratchet wheel on. Now now I'm putting the barrel wheel on, but I really should have done this in reverse order because, well, it just didn't fit quite right. It was kind of fussy. The hole and the barrel and the wheel was cut oddly for the arbor, so I had to kind of undo that, and here we are, basically undone and getting the barrel wheel screwed down. Sometimes these are reverse threaded, but not in this case. Now we get the ratchet wheel on, and it's a little easier to get those threads meshed. And we'll get that screw, which is reverse threaded. The ratchet wheel is often, almost always reverse threaded. And we'll get that snugged down. Now here I'm putting a little oil on the exit side for the stone on the pallet fork. There in the frames you can see the world's most expensive lubrication. Works out to something like 6 figures per gallon, no joke, but that's enough to last more than a lifetime in that tiny little bottle. We'll get our pallet fork cock on. Now you want to be very gentle here. Those pivots are very easy to damage on the pallet cock or on the pallet fork. So I tighten and then I test operation, and then you'll see that I tighten again, and then I'll go back and I'll test operation. You just want to make sure that pallet fork is swinging back and forth, that it's not bound up. And now to get our balance wheel on. And this was a little fussy. Be very careful not to bend that delicate hairspring. I personally have damaged hairsprings even just by blowing too much air too hard with the blower, so they are very fragile. Once we make sure that our pivots are lined up, we'll go ahead and tighten this down, and we'll see if we can get some life in there. That's a good sign. And we're going to working on getting the jewel out from underneath this shock setting spring. Using a little Rodico to kind of hold, make sure it doesn't fly out on me. I'm sorry about the angle on this. The overhead camera died during this, but you can get a little sense of that spring. It's similar to a Inca block. It did come out. That was not my intention, but it did come out in this case. And we'll get these jewels cleaned up and dried, and get this lubrication set. A little drop of oil. And this plate back in. Now we'll move on to the balance spring, or the balance jewel. Get that in place. I like to use a little Rodico and hold it over the setting and place it, sort of nudge it into place with the tweezers. And now I'm trying to get our spring that holds the setting in place, and I'll spare you the torment with that, but I did manage to get it in there without too much fuss. Now this is the jewel for the motion side. The jewel's stuck in the basket, so all right, get our pivot stone in there. And now for the capstone, lubricated, and manipulate that off the Rodico into place. Make sure that drop of oil doesn't get disrupted, because if it gets disrupted and smeared, you have to start all over. You have to take it out, you have to clean it, and reapply the lubrication. And I'm going to work that spring back in with the pegwood and the tweezers. That looks pretty good. Now we'll move over to the other side. We'll call this the keyless works now. This is basically the dial side. Lubricating the sliding pinion and now the stem. Get our sliding pinion dropped in place. There we go. Get this pinion and the stem in. Now here I'm going to speed through the lubrication of the assembly for, you know, the clutch and the springs, but I'm basically putting a much heavier lubrication here where it's metal on metal. And we'll get the clutch and now the clutch spring in place, and use a little piece of pegwood to hold that in place while I basically lever that spring in place there. Got to be careful to not let that thing fly off, because they are a pain and they will fly several feet. A little bit of lubrication on that post for that pinion there. I'm going to put a lubrication on this post and a little lubrication on that rail there. Get our hour wheel. Well, that's actually kind of an intermediate wheel, not the hour wheel. It's a little check. Now we'll look at this. This is a cover and spring. Get that nudged into place. This thing is really close to being back together, and I'm pretty excited about it. I've actually dabbled a lot in vintage Timexes, those with the more pedestrian movement, and they are very hit or miss. We'll get the screw tightened down here that'll hold our stem in place. That's the setting lever screw. A little lubrication and get this last cover in place. Okay, now our cannon pinion goes on. That little snap. Touch of lubrication. Now for the hour wheel. And the dial washer. It's getting real, folks. Let's see if we can ease the dial feet into the movement. I don't want to bend the feet. Tighten down the dial screws. Get the hour hand on. I like to use a little piece of Rodico to wipe debris off gently and hover it over the dial and press it into place with the tools here. Same procedure with the minute hand. Hover that over, just kind of get it preset, and then we'll finish pressing it down. And we'll make sure everything's lined up. That took place off camera, unfortunately, but we'll go ahead and start casing this up. Get our stem back in here. Movement ring holder. Nudge that back over the stem. There's a little notch in that ring for the stem. We'll make that fit the way that it should. We'll tighten our stem back down. Let's get this case back on. Well, it looks like a watch again. What do you think? All right, so now I'm going to speed through this process of me sanding with several different grades of sandpaper, starting with about 800 grit all the way up to 3000 grit, chased with some polishing with Polywatch. I think this crystal has actually turned out pretty well. I know that case isn't in the best shape, but it has a nice enough appearance to it. The patina doesn't bother me too much, and I'm pretty pleased with the results on the time grapher. We're at +1, -1, essentially 0 seconds per day, and amplitude is okay considering we reused the mainspring. I would much rather reuse a mainspring if possible, just for, well, environmental consideration. That's a huge difference for a watch that wouldn't tick more than a few seconds at a time. Here is the watch revealed with a medium brown strap that I'm trying out. Hey, let me know what suggestions you have as far as what strap would look best. Anyway, thanks for joining me again in this video. It always helps if you click like, and even more so if you subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one.